Welcome everyone to session A. So this is the military session, and we have a large number of very interesting abstracts and research presentations for you today. And I think we sort of see the scope of military operations broadening with Op Laser, not just combat, aircrew, naval operations, but now we have our domestic operations, vaccinating in remote communities. And so as the scope widens, I think the need for research to help inform how we conduct our operations and how we move past the operations and how we come out of these operations is very important. So I think our first session today is from Dr. Etienne Rollin, and he's going to present his work on the analysis of the impact of different recruitment strategies on the medical officer's employment duration in the Canadian Armed Forces. So Dr. Rollin.
Okay, hi. So my name is Etienne Rollin. I'll be talking about the analysis of the impact of different recruitment strategies on the medical officer employment duration in the Canadian Armed Forces. So a few slides for disclosure. I am not in a relationship with any commercial interests. This program has not received any financial support or in-kind support, so there's no potential for conflicts of interest. And no potential bias has been identified. So at the end of this talk, you'll be able to compare the effect of different methods to incentivize the recruitment of medical officers by the Canadian Armed Forces, by identifying critical periods of attrition in their employment in the regular force. So I work for the Director General Military Personnel Research and Analysis, DGMPRE. That's within the Commander Military Personnel Command. And we deliver a comprehensive personnel research program for the Department of National Defense and the CAF. So there are 5 directorates. I work for the Director Research Workforce Analytics. So we take care of supporting workforce planning, development of analysis tools, simulation models, forecasting tools, and we report on personnel metrics to inform the development of policies and programs. So let's talk a little bit about medical officers in the CAF. So these are the doctors of the CAF. So they provide primary health care services for the CAF members. There's currently 364 medical officers in the regular force, and this occupation is currently experiencing shortages. So we're talking about 64% of the level that the CAF would like to have. So there's missing about a third of what they would like. This could be due to high attrition, could be due to difficulty to recruit, people on leave, or even training, because medical officers, the training is quite long. So if we look at the medical officer historical population, so in blue, what you see here is the number of medical officers as a function of time. So for the last 12 years. In the last couple of years, there's been a slight increase in the numbers. This could be due to a lower attrition. So in red, what you have is the attrition numbers. So the solid line is the running average. In the last couple of years, maybe because of COVID, the attrition is slightly lower. So this could explain the slight increase in their population. So the question I'm trying to ask is, or to answer, is out of the 3 main entry plans, so the way they recruit military officers, is there one that leads to longer careers in the CAF? So let's go over the three entry plans. There's MOTP for the new CAF members, and they get their education paid for. There's one called MMTP, the Military Medical Training Plan. And this is for existing CAF member. Let's say a nurse in the CAF, they want to change occupation, so they apply for this program and they get their school paid for. The third one is the direct entry plan. So that's for new CAF members already having a medical degree. They just want to join the CAF, and they get a signing bonus for that. So you'll see those three entry plans quite a bit in my talk, so it's important to try to remember what they mean, but I'll remind you what they are later. So my first problem was how to determine the entry plan of a medical officer. In our data, we do have a value for the entry plan, but it's not updated with time. So we only have the very first one. So I had to correct for this. So I went and I looked in the history of each member. I looked at the rank. I looked at the first unit. So if they were part of a Canadian university having a medical program for the first unit or not. And also looked at if they had a different occupation previously in their career. And with all that information, I was able to get the correct entry plan. Once I have that, I look at the history, the employment history of each member, count the number of years of service. But I had another problem. Our data started in 1997, so we don't have anything before that. So I had to use something called the Kaplan Meyer estimator for survival to get some kind of information out of this that is not biased. So these are the only two equations that I have in my talk. They are very simple once you start looking into them. The first one, you simply take the number of people leaving at time t, let's say after 5 years, over the total population. You do 1 minus that to give you a percentage, and you multiply each time steps to get a survival percentage. And with that, you can reconstruct a curve, a survival curve. The second equation is the variance. So I use that just to get some kind of uncertainty or confidence interval for each data point. The advantage of using the Kaplan-Meyer estimator is that you can allow for incomplete data. So that's what I was mentioning before. So I left censored data. So the database only contains members that were active after 1997. I can give you an example. If two people join in 95, one of them was released in 96, the other in 98. The one released in 96 would not be part of our database, but the 98 would be part of our database. So that would naturally bias the data towards longer career. So I just censor all the data that I could not observe completely. So everything before 97 is ignored. Although people after 97, even if they were hired before, I could subsequently use their data. Okay, so once I have all of this, I plug numbers in equations and I obtain this graph. So on the x-axis, you have the years of service in the regular force. On the y-axis, you have the survival percentage, and you have three curves. The green one is MMTP, so people that are already CAF members, they just want to change occupation, become medical officers. The blue one are the new recruits. They get their school paid by the CAF. The orange curve is the direct entry officer. So people just already trained, just joining the CAF. And you see that the green one, the people tend to stay longer. But this is a bit misleading, because the green curve, the MTP, I also count the previous occupation. So the year, it's a total year of service. So if they were a nurse before, this would be counted there. So I have to correct for that to compare, to be able to compare them fairly. Another thing is that both MOTP and MMTP, so green and blue, the training time is included in those curves. So the members can spend 5-6 years in training in medical school. So the way I fixed that to be able to allow for a fair comparison between the entry plans is that I start the clock when they finish medical school. So I call it the adjusted year of service. Another thing is that I get rid of all the time spent in other occupations. So ideally, I would measure the year of service at the point that the medical officers are fully qualified in their occupation. However, this is very difficult. But I think the time they finish medical school is a good time to start their clock. When I use that adjusted year of service, all three curves are very close to each other, so there's no significant difference. One thing I forgot to mention before is the colored band around each curve is the 95% confidence interval. So you see that all three curves are fairly similar. If you look carefully at the blue curve, there are things that some kind of a structure. So there's something at 4 years of service. There is another drop at 16 years of service. I want to talk a little bit about that. So the drop at 4 years of service is likely due to the end of the obligatory service. So when MOTP people get their education paid for, they sign for a certain period of obligatory service, depending on how much time they spend in school. And that drop just means, so at 4 years of service, just means that those members just quit after their obligatory service. Same thing at 16 years of service. They seem to all leave when it's time to, when they are entitled to an immediate annuity, so they just retire. So I wanted to compare my analysis with something else done. I only found one study by the US Army physicians. They found a lack of significant difference between their entry plans, just like me. But a direct comparison was very difficult because their entry plans and the obligatory service period are significantly different. So in conclusion, all three entry plans seem to be fairly equivalent in terms of number of years of service, but that's after correcting for education time and time spent in other occupation. So if I just quickly go back to the first graph that I showed, I said that this is not a fair comparison because the green one, they spend some time in their previous occupation, but you can also argue that maybe those members in other occupation would have just left the CAF and given the opportunity for a new career, they stayed longer. So it's not totally unfair. Maybe that's what you want, to maximize the amount of time that CAF members spend by offering something new for them. And you end up with medical officers, but also a previous career as something else. So I already mentioned that all three entry plans are equivalent. So this lack of difference led to a greater importance for other factors. And there was another study by the DGMPRA based on interviews called Factors Affecting the Recruitment and Retention of Medical Officers in the Canadian Armed Force. So it just put more weights over that study, and they found that most dissatisfiers were related to impact of posting on personal professional life, skill fade, insufficient compensation, issues with career management, progression, and work tempo. So these are my references. And I'm open for questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Roland. So I'm just looking at the chat, but perhaps I'll kick off and just say, and as a medical officer who went through, although I think I wasn't included because I preceded the start date of your study. So if all three programs are the same in terms of retention after the finishing of med school, does your research suggest, should we be investing in all three of the programs equally, or are there any other distinctions between the medical officers produced and the outcomes of interest to leadership that you would recommend one over the other, or do you think that they're all the same?
Well, personally, in terms of maximizing the amount of time they spend in the CAF, they seem to be equivalent. As medical officer, but like I said in the talk, the MMTP members, so people that had a previous occupation, they end up spending a longer career in the CAF in a different role, but that's something important. The other thing is the CAF can't really be picky. They need medical officers. It's quite obvious. So whatever they can take, they should. The DEO, the direct entry officers, so the medical officers that they come from, they are civilian, and then they are trained to be CAF members. Their number is tiny, so we're talking about 5 per year. So it's not a big flow of people. So maybe that's one way to increase their numbers, maybe just offering a bigger bonus. There is also the possibility to change the engagement, so the number of years they spend in the CAF, but that's at a higher level. There's the obligatory service also. We see a clear drop for an occupation. But I think like I mentioned in my conclusion, looking at the conclusion of a different study by the DGMPRA that identified a few dissatisfiers in their career, like impact of posting on personal life, skill fade. I've heard also that medical officers, they join the CAF to go abroad and help. And a lot of them, after several years, they are confined to admin roles, so administrative roles. And this was a dissatisfier as well. So I think it's not one simple fix. There's a lot of tiny things that they can adjust to increase the number of medical officers in the CAF.
Thank you very much. I think we are at time, so I don't see any other questions. So thank you, Dr. Roland.
Welcome.
So we're going to move to our next presenter. So this is Ms. Angélie Daté. So she'll be talking about, she'll be validating the Canadian Forces Aircrew selection test in predicting pilot training performance.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for attending my presentation on the validation of the Canadian Forces Aircrew selection test in predicting pilot training performance. So my name is Angélie Daté, and my research was funded by the Department of National Defense, and we don't have any commercial interests to disclose. Again, we don't have any commercial support to disclose. My research was supported through the Department of National Defense and by the Royal Canadian Air Force. We also don't have any mitigating potential bias to disclose. So in regards to our learning objectives, the primary focus of this presentation is to present ways to look for gender discrimination in selection tools and what you can do with regards to mitigating that adverse impact that could result from any tools that you are using for selection. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about the Canadian Forces Aircrew selection test. From now on, I'm going to refer to it as the Cfast. It is a modified version of the Royal Air Force Aircrew Aptitude Test, referred to as the RAFAT, which was developed by the UK Air Force. So this is a computer-based test battery. It is comprised of approximately 20 tests, which range in time from 4 minutes to about 40 minutes. And it takes approximately 8 hours to complete. So that time is split up between 2 days. So candidates complete about 4 hours of testing on day 1 and an additional 4 hours of testing on day 2. It's been used to select for all aircrew positions, so pilots, aerospace control officers, and air combat systems officers in Canada. It has been used since 2013, and the testing was updated in 2016. When we look at passing the Cfast, an individual must pass the minimum battery score. So today we're looking at pilots. So they have to pass a pilot battery score, which is calculated based on the tests that are taken over the course of that 8-hour period. They must also pass the scores for some domains that are also evaluated. So the domains for the Cfast pilot battery, there are 7. They are strategic task management, perceptual processing, short-term memory and capacity, spatial reasoning, symbolic reasoning, central information processing, and psychomotor ability. So each of the domains is calculated using between 1 or more tests. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 20 tests that are included in this battery overall, and they feed into different domains depending on the occupation, so pilot, AEC, or AXO, as well as the specific domain. So each of these domains are scored on a STAININE, so it's a standardized form of testing, and each domain also has a cutoff score that a candidate must reach in addition to that total pilot cutoff score. So the Cfast pilot battery was validated against phase 2 pilot training data. We collected data from 2016 to 2020. This is when people were in that phase 2 of pilot training. And the predictors we included were the Canadian Forces Aptitude Test, which I will refer to as the CFAT for simplicity moving forward, and the Trait Self-Descriptive Personality Inventory, or the TSD. These are 2 tests that are used by the Canadian Armed Forces in selection across the board. So if someone is applying tomorrow to join the CAF, they will be taking these tests. We also looked at the Cfast as a predictor, obviously, and performance was measured by a composite of scores from phase 2 of pilot training. So we looked at different aspects of performance that were being graded at phase 2 that feed into whether or not you pass or fail. and we created a composite score to have a more fulsome view of people's performance on training. So our sample included both men and women, not a lot of women, unfortunately. And it was a primarily Anglophone sample. So we had 26 Francophones. When we look at running statistical measures and evaluating different tools, we have to split them based on the language in which people conducted the CFAT. The reason being that it's not an interchangeable test by language, because there are problem-solving questions as well as verbal reasoning questions. It's really not possible to consider, the 15 or so questions in one as equivalent to those in the other, because language has a pretty big impact on how someone would perform, and they have different cutoffs and different norms applied. So we did our analyses separating out Anglophones and Francophones. And the aim of this was to determine if the Cfast pilot battery would predict performance in phase 2 pilot training. We selected phase 2 because it's the last point at which all pilots are together. After that, they get sorted into different streams, and that really reduces our sample size. All the predictive analyses that we are going to present were conducted using the Anglophone population, because the Francophone population was just very small by comparison. So if we look at regression, we first put in the CFAT total. So that includes all of the questions that are included in the CFAT, as well as the conscientiousness and emotional stability factors of the TSD. The reason we selected those is because they are the ones that are the most predictive of performance on the job, as well as they are the ones that are used most commonly in selection within the CAF. Then at the second step of the regression, we included the Cfast pilot battery. The reason we did it in this order is that any candidate for anything in the CAF will be taking the CFAT and the TSD, and the Cfast really should be something that's adding above and beyond our existing model. And as you can see, the Cfast predicted an additional 18% of variance in training performance over and above the CFAT and the TSD. So as I mentioned earlier, we put in the CFAT and TSD first, and then the Cfast. So the CFAT and the TSD didn't really predict significant or even a large amount of variance in performance, which might seem a little strange considering they're so widely used, but it's important to note that people have to already meet a cutoff that was established based on prior research in order to enter training. So it's a very restricted range that we're dealing with. So it would be unlikely at this point that we would see a great deal of variance being explained, because we've already used that information to reduce our sample size and only put people who we think would be, who would do well in training into training based on those two scores. So similarly, only 18% of variance was being explained by the Cfast, but the Cfast also has a cutoff score that was met prior to entry into training. So in addition to looking at the Cfast total battery score, we also wanted to look at the 7 domains, because individuals need to meet cutoffs in each of those 7 domains in order to enter pilot training. So as we can see, when considered together, the domains were also significantly predictive of phase 2 training performance, and we're predicting an additional 24.5% of performance over and above the CFAT and the TSD. So combined, it's only slightly more predictive than the total Cfast battery score. However, not all of the domains were predictive. So if we take a look at the different domains, it was strategic task management, perceptual processing, spatial reasoning, and psychomotor ability that were predicting performance in phase 2 training. But how well a test predicts performance is only one portion of what we need to look at when considering whether or not to use a tool for selection. We also need to look at whether or not it influences different groups differently, specifically if it results in adverse impact. So adverse impact refers to when the selection rate of a designated group is lower than that of the comparison group. In order to determine whether or not the Cfast was resulting in adverse impact, we wanted to see how people were performing prior to getting to training. So we collected data from individuals who had taken the Cfast from 2013 to 2018 as part of Aircrew selection. So we did look at everyone who had applied to Aircrew across the board. The majority do want to be pilots, but we just looked at everyone's score to make it simple. And we focused on the total battery score and domain scores and the achievement of the required cutoffs. So there were a little over 3,000 total pilot candidates at this stage. There were approximately 400 females and 2,700 males. So in Canada, there are 3 designated groups underneath the Employment Equity Act as are applicable to a military context. So that's women, visible minorities, and Indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, we were not able to have sufficient data regarding membership to visible minority and Indigenous groups, which is why we're only focusing on females for the purposes of this study. We do also understand that gender and sex are not the same. However, data that is collected at the time of selection is based on sex and not gender. But in order to better understand how this test negatively impacts female applicants, we looked at both the statistical differences from a standard model in terms of the scores that were achieved both on the total battery and the individual domains. And we also looked at the 4/5 rule, which is a standard that has been used to determine if there is an unreasonable difference in the results between a majority group and a protected group. So under this rule, a passing rate for members of a designated group should be no less than 80% of that of the comparison group or the majority group. So if we take a look at the results from a statistical standpoint, so if we're looking at the total score achieved on the pilot battery, as well as the STAY9 scores for the different domains, we can see that there's a significant difference in scores based on sex for 6 of the 7 domains, as well as the total pilot battery score, with only perceptual processing not resulting in a statistical difference. So although these results were a little alarming, we also wanted to take a look at things from the 4/5 rule, which looks more at the pass rate as opposed to the actual score achieved. If we take a look at the 4/5 rule, however, it did seem that female candidates were still not performing as well, or not passing at a similar rate to male candidates, with the largest discrepancy occurring with symbolic reasoning and psychomotor ability. Again, female candidates did pass at a rate higher to male candidates for perceptual processing. However, it did not meet that 4/5 cutoff. Also, they are not the protected group. So usually that's not where that interest lies. It would still be worth noting though. So in addition to looking at those pass rates, we also needed to combine that with the predictive validity to determine, is this going to have a real impact on selection? And we did find that of the 4 predictive domains, 3 did result in adverse impact against women. So strategic task management, spatial reasoning, and psychomotor ability were all resulting in adverse impact against female applicants, but were also strongly predictive of performance. So this brings us to the difficult issue of what to do with a test that is a significant predictor of performance, but is found to have adverse impact against female candidates. So one way we can mitigate this adverse impact is to remove the cutoff scores for domains that are resulting in adverse impact. So the RCAF started by removing the cutoff scores for the 3 domains that were not predicted. The reason being they're not significantly adding to the predictive model, and they are resulting in adverse impact. So in that way, we can retain all of the predictive ability without having any additional unnecessary adverse impact. Another thing that was looked at was creating a selection pool as opposed to top-down selection based on the Cfast. So much like the Cfast and the TSDPI are used as hurdles, you just need to meet that cutoff. The Cfast would also be used as one hurdle that must be met. So once someone is in the pool, their score might be compensated by other aspects. So if a female applicant just met the cutoff for the Cfast and might have scored slightly lower than someone else, so a male applicant, but outperformed them in other areas, they would still have a chance at being selected for pilot training. One other thing that we need to consider is that although we can look at improving our selection tools, and we absolutely should, there should be a continued targeted recruitment of women in aircrew positions. It's important to note that there were actually only 12.75% of applicants who are female. This is a little lower than that 25% target for females in the Canadian Armed Forces. So continuing to look for ways to include women in aircrew positions and having them apply might also increase the number of women who will then be successful on tests. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to my presentation. These are the references that were used for the creation of the slides that were included. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think with the increased focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion, this type of research is of critical importance. I'm just looking to see if there's any questions, but I'll start off and just ask, you presented that 12.7% of applicants were women. Is there a sense of what the pass rate was of women compared to men? Like how many women actually failed the course and were, I guess, did not continue on training because of the Cfast? Like what implications did it have on their pilot career?
So the Cfast is actually administered prior to being selected for training. So it would essentially take you out of the running before you even had the opportunity.
And do you have an idea of what the magnitude of the failure rate was for women versus men?
% of that of males. I don't.
If you don't, that's fine. I was just curious to see what the actual effect on women who were told to cease the process.
There was fewer than 10% of individuals included on training who are women.
Okay, and so then fewer than 10%, so probably maybe 3%, an absolute number of 3% who failed. So about a quarter of the women did not proceed on, I think, is what I'm hearing.
Well, a better way to look at it would be that there was a greater reduction in the females who passed. So actually, most people do not pass the Cfast. It is,
okay,
as I said, it's very widely taken. Many people would like to be part of aircrew, particularly pilots. So it is one of the big barriers to entry into the occupation, somewhat purposefully. We only have a limited amount of funding and it's very expensive to train pilots. And as such, one of the things that screens out a lot of individuals is this big 8 hours of testing. However, I would say probably an additional 20% of male applicants are successful. So like an increase in the percentage instead of looking at raw numbers, since male applicants so vastly outnumber female applicants, even at that first stage.
Great, thank you. And there is a question from the listeners. So given the small pool of female applicants, how can you definitively conclude the test is the issue versus the quality of the applicants alone?
Although there is a relatively small pool of female applicants, we still had, even at 2018, almost 400 females who had completed the test. So although it is a comparative
I think we may have lost her, or I think we lost you for a bit there. Or
oh, sorry. I'll start from the beginning. Although that the comparative number of females versus males is quite small. There's still a relatively general to know what the quality of applicants are compared to the Canadian population. But usually the individuals that you would be able to access are those who want to join an occupation. So there could be theoretically someone who is very skilled in all these types of testing, but if they have no interest in being a pilot, then that doesn't particularly help us. That being said, it is of interest to the RCIF and the CAF as a whole to continue to recruit females and women and also to make them more interested in careers in the CAF.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the message from that is really we need to, I guess, recruit more women to become interested in aircrew selection, and how do we do that? So I think we are at time. So thanks very much. And so now I'm looking forward to welcoming Dr. Andrea Brown. She'll be talking about gendered experience of operational deployment in the Canadian Armed Forces. Dr. Brown?
I'd like to thank the CIMVHR organizers for allowing me to present today. My name is Andrea Brown, and I will be talking about a research project looking at women's experiences during operational deployment. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I'd like to start by acknowledging that McMaster University is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. This project has been funded by a Mines Targeted Engagement Grant. No member of the research team works for, consults with, or receives any financial funding from the Mines program other than through research grants. At the end of this presentation, you should have a better understanding of the challenges female veterans experience during deployment, including military sexual misconduct, as well as the rewards of operational deployment and some changes to Canadian Armed Forces culture. I'd also like to acknowledge my project team. This includes Alexandra Heber, Rosemary Park, Margaret McKinnon, Ruth Lanius, Heather Millman, Kim Ritchie, Sarah Lade, and Special Advisor Karen Davis. Canada's defense policy states that the Canadian Armed Forces is committed to attracting, recruiting, and retaining more women with the goal of having 25% representation by 2026. More women in the ranks means more women will be deployed to operational theater. However, at this time, there is little known about women's experiences while they are deployed. For this study, we conducted 1-hour interviews with female CAF veterans, both cisgendered and transgendered, to understand the challenges and rewards of deployment. This includes challenges they encountered in general and challenges they encountered because they are women, what they found rewarding about the deployment, supports they received and didn't receive, and advice they would give to other women who are getting ready to deploy. We spoke with 15 CAF veterans representing all 3 forces. All of the women were regular force, 8 of which had also been reservists. 9 of the women released as senior officers. The years of service represented by our participants span the early 1980s through to 2021. The average age of participants was 52 years old, and 80% were of European descent. The purpose of deployment is to complete a mission, and each CAF member has a job to do in order for the mission to be successful. In doing their job, women work with the CAF structure, including its policies and procedures, and with other CAF members. They often also work with other militaries and with members of the host nation and NGOs. In analyzing the interviews, we identified 3 factors that impact women's abilities to do their jobs when deployed. These are the degree to which women are accepted as members of the deployment team, the degree to which women's needs, that is their psychological, physical, and safety needs, are integrated into the deployment, and the degree to which women are respected and their contributions to the deployment are valued. All members face challenges when deployed. The veterans we spoke with described facing challenges that all CAF members face, such as threat to safety, missing their family, extreme workloads, environmental challenges such as weather, and equipment challenges. But the veterans we spoke with also described additional challenges they faced during deployment because they are women. In the remainder of this presentation, I will describe some of the challenges that impacted the degree to which they were accepted, integrated, and valued as members of the deployment. Again, acceptance is the degree to which women are fully welcomed as members of the deployment team. When women are not accepted, they are treated as others. Participants describe differing levels of acceptance from other CAF members, other military members, and locals. This was especially true of deployments that took place prior to the 2010s. Participants told stories of the skepticism they faced about women's ability to do their job, having other militaries or locals refusing to work with women unless a male counterpart explained that they had to work with a woman, and being purposely excluded from deployment-related events. One woman described a situation in which her entire team was prepared to deploy, but the deployment was postponed because she was the subject matter expert, and the Canadian contingent commander did not want a military female on his base because he had given the women's quarters to senior NCMs. Other women described facing outright harassment while on deployment. One woman stated, "The women that deployed together, we were treated very badly by the middle NCO level, from master corporal to sergeant. I'll put the warrant officer in there because he refused to do anything about it. And the treatment and harassment, it was abuse. It was a very abusive environment, and it was demoralizing. I lost a lot of weight on that tour." Integration refers to the degree to which women's needs, psychological, physical, and safety are integrated into the deployment. This includes formal structures in place, such as policies and procedures, and informal structures. Some participants described arriving at their deployment location to find that they did not have sleeping quarters or washroom facilities because women had never been at the site before. The options they were provided often lacked adequate privacy or safety. On the other hand, a lack of facilities for women sometimes led them to staying in better facilities than their male counterparts. For example, one woman and her team stayed in a hotel because her superiors didn't want one woman living in a barracks full of men, and she was the only woman. Women also described additional integration challenges, such as using the washroom out on convoys or in locations where women were not frequently found, as well as wearing too heavy kit or kit that was not designed for the average woman's body size. Here's a quote. "Going on a convoy with all men is also not a pleasant experience. Again, because they stop, go to the washroom on the side of the road, because there's landmines on both sides of the road, so there's no place for a woman to go to the washroom. And you can't stop. If you stop one vehicle, you've got to stop the whole convoy. So again, you're always seen as the weak link or the one that's causing a disturbance in terms of having to stop for something as simple as going to the washroom. When they have done that all throughout the whole thing, they regularly stopped and did what they needed to do." The differences in supports for wives versus husbands of deployed members was also noted. Although many praised MFRC for their work, some also noted that supports for wives were more established than supports for husbands, which could add additional stress during the deployment. Valuing is the degree to which women are respected and their contributions to the mission valued. Acceptance and integration both contribute to value. When women are accepted as contributors to the mission and their needs are met, when their contributions are respected and lauded, and when women hold leadership positions because of their contributions to the CAF, then they are valued. Establishing and maintaining respect is important for any soldier deployed. The women we spoke with identified additional barriers to respect that they faced in large part because of gender stereotypes about the types of jobs women could and could not do. These stereotypes included assuming women would be the one to type up documents, that they would cook and do laundry for their team, that women can't get work done because they will be too busy fighting with each other, that women can't be soldiers, and that women can't drive vehicles safely because women are bad drivers. Quote, somehow they kind of came to this understanding that I would do the cooking for the group. And the groceries, you know, why not? I mean, that was pretty funny because every other team, they would pool their money and hire a local, you know, someone to cook, someone to do the groceries because we had a mission to do. There was work that needed to be done, and nowhere in my term of reference did it say that I was there to do the cooking and the cleaning and all of that. Women also noted how quickly rumors could start and how they had to take precautions to avoid situations that could start rumors about them. Some participants also described male counterparts being dismissive of their input. For example, one woman described having men speak over her during meetings. I would like to acknowledge that both men and women are impacted by military sexual misconduct. However, I think it is important to include sexual misconduct in the list of challenges that women face when deployed. This was not a study on sexual misconduct. We did not ask any questions about sexual misconduct at all, and yet 13 of our 15 participants brought up the topic. They provided examples of sexual assault or attempted sexual assault, sexual harassment. Sometimes sexual harassment occurred because the men didn't think their behavior was a problem, and sometimes it occurred because the men were purposefully trying to harm the women. Women also discussed the precautions they and others took to ensure their safety while deployed. Here's a quote. On the ship, you could get a double drink for 30 cents, and they wonder why rape and shit like that is so freaking prevalent. But usually there's alcohol or something else involved, almost always. And I mean, I can't even begin to tell you, even during the deployment, how many times I stopped a woman from being raped and how many women I know were raped. Despite the challenges of deployment and the additional challenges that were specific to being a woman on deployment, our participants described many rewards of deployment. These included having interesting work, the bonds and friendships formed during deployment, the credibility and training that deployment gives CAF members, travel and seeing new cultures. And more than any of these, our participants described the pride they felt in having completed their deployment, the pride in a job well done, the pride in representing Canada, and the pride in making an impact. One woman said, the professional challenges, I accomplished them, and I had a tremendous sense of accomplishment because I did a really good job everywhere I went. While achieving acceptance, integration, and value in the Canadian Armed Forces is an ongoing process, we heard from many participants that the CAF is changing its attitudes towards women on deployment. In fact, some describe the CAF as recently becoming a leader in including and valuing women members. One woman stated, but I think it's changed a lot from what I saw in my later deployment and the women there that were then there. I felt like they were part of the family. They weren't isolated, rejected, or had something more to prove. They didn't have to work 3 times harder to get that recognition. Another woman said, all the people that I was there with were very much like, everybody's doing their job, and this is what Canada is. So I never noticed that there was any negative or big distinctions for women. In summary, women veterans faced many challenges while deployed, both the types of challenges all members face during deployment and challenges they face because they are women. Despite these challenges, deployment provided our participants with many rewards and a great sense of pride. I'd like to end this presentation by thanking our participants. These women have a strong military identity and are proud of their service and their deployments. It was our honor to be able to hear their stories. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. And we're now moving to Ms. Ashley Williams, who will be talking about Canadian Armed Forces members' perspectives on health and health service transition prior to military release. Ms. Williams?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ashley Williams, a PhD candidate at Queen's University, and I'm here to speak to you about our project called Canadian Armed Forces Members' Perspectives on health and health service transition prior to military release. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Drs. Heidi Krem, Catherine Donnelly, David Pedler, and Brent Wolfram. And before I get into the presentation, I just wanted to note that this presentation is part of a much larger study on well-being and military to civilian transition. And I'd like to acknowledge the project team members who are listed on the left of the slide here. And also note that the project funding was from Veterans Affairs Canada. And I myself have scholarship funding from the Government of Ontario, Wounded Warriors Canada, and CIMVHR, as well as Queen's University. There's no other commercial interest to disclose other than the grant and research funding I noted on the previous slide. And there's no commercial support to disclose and no potential conflicts of interest. And I have no potential bias to mitigate. By the end of the presentation, I hope that you'll be able to describe the concerns related to health service transition among Canadian Armed Forces members with an imminent release date. So an inherent part of the military to civilian transition is the transition from the Canadian Forces Health Services to the public health services within each province. So before release, members access the Canadian Forces Health Services, which is a federally operated health system where there's really very little navigation required on the part of the CAF member. And after release, veterans have to access the public health system, which is quite different, where really it's up to each individual to navigate that system on their own. And so veterans may experience difficulty navigating a new health system on their own, especially if they join service at a very young age before which their parents were the ones responsible for health service navigation. And this is really important because veterans experience more health problems than the general Canadian population. So being able to continuously access health services through the military to civilian transition is really important. There's really very little research specifically focusing on the health service transition associated with MCT, so we're hoping to address that knowledge gap. So as I mentioned, this presentation is part of a much larger project on military to civilian transition. And the goal of that project was to better understand mental health and well-being of releasing CAF members and veterans through the peri-release period. So we looked at this experience both before and after release. And for this presentation, we're really zeroing in on health and health service through the military to civilian transition, and hoping to understand CAF members' pre-release perspectives on health and health service transition. So the larger study used a qualitative longitudinal design where we collected data both before and after the release date. For this presentation, we're focusing specifically on the pre-release data. And we used purposive and maximum variation sampling to obtain a sample of CAF members before they release and allow us to get a really good representation across different service types, release types, service elements, and geographic regions across the country. We recruited through the Canadian Armed Forces and Veterans Affairs Canada, and we also had public outreach through CAF and DND publications, as well as social media. So for data collection, we conducted semi-structured in-depth interviews and a socio-demographic questionnaire. The interview guide was based on the literature and our conceptual framework, and they were all conducted by telephone. And the socio-demographic questionnaire collected demographic data around military service, employment, health status, and other information. And those were primarily collected through an online survey, but we did have some come in through mail or phone. And for this presentation, we're focusing on the data that was collected before release. So that would have been done 0 to 6 months prior to the release date. So for the larger project, initial analysis was done using grounded theory techniques. And one of the core categories that came out of that analysis was health. And so we used phenomenological data analysis techniques to really dive into that core category and pull out the experience of preparation and anticipation of that health service transition and the impact of health status. So we interviewed 80 CAF members prior to their release, and we had a good mix of service element and geographic region, as well as service type. We did have some overrepresentation of women and medical releases. So the proportions of those were higher in our sample than you'd find in the CAF population and the veteran population. So there were two primary themes that emerged from our analysis of the health data. And the first one was really around the interaction between health and the anticipated transition trajectory that participants expected or hoped to have. And the second one was around the preparation for the shift between military and civilian health systems. And I'll go into each of these a little bit more in depth. And we'll start off with the first theme around interaction between health and anticipated transition trajectory. So participants really recognize that stress is kind of an inherent part of MCT, just like it would be for any major transition. And there were also some concerns about health issues impacting transition trajectory. So age and or service-related health issues for some people, we're really having an impact on planning or vision for what their transition would look like. This could include having to release earlier than they'd anticipated. And it could also include having activities that they were looking forward to, whether it was career change, leisure activities, or other activities, having a change in what those look like because of the way their health issues are impacting what they're able to do. And this was really amplified for participants who had known and ongoing health issues where there was really a lot of uncertainty around what that's going to look like for them going forward. And there were also some participants who expected an improvement in their well-being after release for a variety of reasons. So some people were in really stressful jobs in the CAF, and they were looking forward to having a little bit less stress after they left service. And for some people, they were ready for a change and ready to move on to the next chapter in their lives. And so I've got some quotes here that really exemplify these points. So the first one is really around the stress of transition. So the participant says, the stress of discontinuation, the moment when I will return my ID card, it is major at that moment. And the second quote here really focuses on health issues impacting one's vision for their transition. So the participant says, the physical disability right now is getting, and I mean, that should be eventually resolved with the surgery, but it's still like, wait a minute, this is not what I planned for. And then the third quote here really speaks to that hope for improved well-being after release. And the participant says, I was getting drained being in the job I was in, so I look forward to being able to relax. So now we'll dive into the second theme, which is around anticipating the shift between military and civilian health systems. So here, participants really recognize that access and continuity in the military are very good, and that may be lost in the civilian system after they release. And also concern around figuring out how to navigate this new system that they're not used to. And there's also some concern around continuity and access through the shift between the two systems. So in particular, a concern around a potential gap in access to health services after they release. And even more specifically, many participants were concerned about being able to find a family doctor on the provincial side because of the difficulty sort of broadly in being able to do that. So that was certainly something that was on participants' mind, anticipating that change. And then going off of those 2 points, the imminent and abrupt loss of health services from the military was something that was really disconcerting to people. It kind of made things a little bit more urgent in terms of being able to set up health providers on the civilian side. And this was particularly salient for participants with ongoing relationships with many health providers in the military. So being able to set up this new team of health providers on the civilian side was something that was really worrisome for them. And there was concern around what kind of impact that's going to have on continuity and then subsequently on their health status. So again, I've got some quotes that exemplify this theme. So the first two here really are focusing on how things were when participants were in service and then trying to get used to this new system. So the first participant here says, I never had to worry about finding a doctor. You know, don't have to find a dentist. The dentist happens. Never had to pay for medications. And the second participant says, when you're in the military, medical is not something you think about. All of a sudden, when I'm out of the military, I have to figure out what, you know, all this stuff. And then the next quote here, this all came from one participant, and they're really sort of exemplifying that abrupt shift between systems. The day you're finished with the military, you have no more access to any service that you had access to before. All these things you have to get used to that you're not used to. And then they go on to say, it all stops, including my psychotherapy. I have to leave his care at a critical time, a time when I'm going to need him. Basically, the day you leave the military, you're just left flapping in the wind. So our results really indicate that health and health service transition have an impact on MCT, and that this is really something that's on the minds of releasing military members prior to their release, particularly those who have ongoing health issues. And our results really have implications for policy and program development at the federal and provincial level that can really be aimed at improving this continuity and continuous access of service through the military to civilian transition. And also, it's important to improve quality of care by increasing civilian healthcare providers' knowledge of military and veteran health needs, because it's the civilian healthcare providers who are really meeting those needs after release. So it's important that they have the knowledge and skills to be able to address those unique needs. And we also really need more research to further address the knowledge gap of health transition during MCT so that we can more thoroughly understand the challenges that veterans encounter, so that we can better inform MCT policy going forward. I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'd be happy to welcome any questions or comments anyone has. Before we do that, though, I just want to note my references here in case anybody would like to would like further resources or information on this area. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Williams. Very, very interesting. Did you get a sense that, because you divided your cohort into those who were medical release and those who weren't, were there any differences in the themes that emerged from the two different types of releases?
Thank you for that question. It's very interesting. So we didn't necessarily do separate analyses on each of those, but what I will say is that there did seem to be a difference in the experience of members who had ongoing health issues, whether they were being medically released or not, and those who didn't. And I think the reason for that is that they're sort of more keenly aware that there could be problems if they have a gap in access to a family doctor or other health services. So they're kind of anticipating that and a little bit more worried about that than those who are not having those same degree of health issues.
Great. And I don't see another question yet. So maybe perhaps I'll just ask a follow-on question, which is just, do you think, are there any, well, based on your research, are there any structural changes to the transition to civilian life that you might recommend to senior leadership?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question. So I think the most salient thing that's come out of data analysis from both this project and another one that I'll be presenting on later is that abrupt drop off of service is really creating issues. So if there was some sort of formalized program or service that could help veterans connect to a primary care provider before they actually release, and there's other issues there too. So for example, there are veterans who really, or members who really couldn't start that process before release because you don't get a provincial health card until the day you release, which makes it hard then for civilian providers to take you on. So, ways of working with the provinces to perhaps allow access to that provincial health insurance earlier, and also something a little bit more formal to make that connection to civilian providers.
Great, thank you. And you, two questions now from the group. Question one, did you look at data with respect to province of release?
That is a great question. I haven't delved into the data that specifically, but there were participants who talked about how they weren't really all that worried about the health service transition because they knew there were doctors available in their area or in the area that they were planning to move to afterwards. So that definitely did come up, and then vice versa, people who knew it was going to be tough in their area. So, but that is an excellent question. Thank you.
And one last question, and then I think we need to move on for time. Thinking about Etienne's presentation on the attrition of our doctors from the military, is there an effort to track released medical professionals and provide releasing members referrals to doctors familiar with military service? I know that anecdotally there's some effort on that locally, but interested to know if you've seen any evidence of that systemically.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand the question. So you're asking if there's been any effort to connect releasing medical officers?
Connecting releasing members to retired medical officers now in civilian practice.
Again, I haven't seen anything formal, but I have in analyzing the data, there's certainly been members who said, my medical officer referred me to a colleague they have on the civilian side. So that, it does happen, but I'm not sure how formal a process that is. It's kind of, they happen to know someone who practices in the area that the person's releasing to.
To Ms. Williams, and she's an associate professor at the School of Rehabilitation Medicine at Queen's University. Dr. Krem.
Welcome to Longitudinal Qualitative Study on the Mental Health and Well-Being of Military Veterans during Canadian Military to Civilian Transition, otherwise known as Task 23. So I'm Heidi Krem. I'm an associate professor at the School of Rehabilitation Therapy at Queen's University and the research advisor for military and veteran families at CIMVHR. And thank you for joining me today. So this study was funded by Veteran Affairs Canada, and I have no relationships with commercial interests outside of the funding agency. This program has received no financial support from commercial entities, no in kind. There are no potential conflicts of interest. So we have no areas where we need to mitigate potential bias. So I'm here representing a very large team. So we're going to speak to the English language results. Dr. Meyer Eichler was my co-PI on the English stream, and Dr. Dave Blackburn was the co-PI at French side. We have a very large team from Queen's and Mount St. Vincent and University of Manitoba, with consultation as well from King's College London. So just wanted to acknowledge all the hard work that everyone's put in over many years to help bring this set of data into discussion today. So as I said, this has been happening for many years, and this was awarded in the last quarter of 2016. It took quite a long time to get the logistical issues related to recruitment across Ministry of Defense and then through the Ministry of Veteran Affairs. So that did take us a long time to kind of start logistically. What I'll report on today is the first 2 time points of the study. So T1 of the longitudinal study was about 6 months and up to date of release. Those interviews were conducted between May 2018 and January 2019. T2 were, those interviews were conducted 6 to 12 months post-release between January 19th and March 2019 and January 2020. Most of the interviews occurred in the window of 6 to 9 months after expected release date for T2. So this study is kind of a special study because it is an in-depth qualitative study, and qualitative research has a different purpose and a set of evaluative standards than quantitative research. So when we talk about our sample size, if you were looking at it from a quantitative lens, you'd think that's not a very big sample size. But in fact, from a qualitative perspective, each of these interviews was between an hour and a half and 2 hours long. We really did have quite an incredible amount of very rich, deep data. And this is, to our knowledge, the first in-depth qualitative longitudinal study of military to civilian transition. So much of the research in this area really looks at things in a retrospective way and doesn't look at release prior to and then follow people forward. In our qualitative longitudinal study, we really employed rigorous data collection and analysis standards. So we have a robust and rich analysis of the findings. So as I mentioned, the sample size is quite large. And one of the things that we found really interesting was that participants were retained. We were quite concerned that we would lose a lot of people over time. But when I get to the sample slide, you'll see just how many we were able to retain from T1 to T2. The other thing that's really kind of noteworthy is that we do have a large number of women participants. So this gives us the opportunity to explore additional insight into their unique circumstances as a sex and gender minority in the Canadian Armed Forces. So data collection took place through a variety of ways. We did have these 2 different points of data collection, and we had this longitudinal qualitative study. We had sociodemographic questionnaires, and we also had semi-structured interviews. We used quite a diverse set of recruitment strategies. For regular force members, we went through the Veteran Affairs Canada Scientific Authority, Personnel Branch Officer, all Canadian Forces bases and wings, the Director for Military Careers Administration. We went through the Maple Leaf, which is a D&D national publication, and social media. We also tried to get reserve force members, and they were individually contacted through the supplementary reserve list. As you can see, we handle at T1 of pre-release 75 English, and we retained that to 70 at 6 to 9 months post-release for T2. We had about a quarter are female in the sample, and we also have an overrepresentation of those who are medically releasing. We have a fair representation of Army, Air Force, and Navy, and that reflects the sizes more or less of those organizations. So we had, through our research contract with Veteran Affairs, we had 5 objectives. Objective 1 was to longitudinally describe the mental health and well-being of CAF members as they progress through the release period of military to civilian transition. And so what we found here was that release type does inform mental health and well-being, but not always in ways that are expected. So very much, it was not predictive. Now, military to civilian transition is experienced as a major life event. And so we saw a lot of different types of emotions, layered emotions, mixed, ambiguous feelings about the transition out of the Canadian Armed Forces. So for those who had the time and the supports to be proactive in their preparation for MCT, we found that those individuals expressed a more positive outlook on the experience. Certainly the challenges, personal, bureaucratic, family, finance, housing, what have you, that were experienced really informed kind of the overall mindset of the releasing member. And certainly their anticipated or identified needs were closely connected to their vision for the future. So they had a sense of what they might need, and then they connected that to what that might mean in who they might be in their future occupational and personal narrative. Objective 2 asked us to identify factors impacting the mental health and well-being of CAF members during the peri-release period. So this allowed us to really dig into the discrete components, and certainly we found that finances were a factor with weighty influence. This was especially true when release was unexpected and participants, quote unquote, ran out of runway in preparing for longer term financial health for themselves and for their families. So depending upon where they were in their work life trajectory, where they were in their family life trajectory, finances had a much bigger or smaller presence for people. Housing is something that was highly interconnected with other factors and the decisions that individuals are making during MCT. Their state of health and ability to access healthcare supports impacted not only their course through MCT, but their ability to kind of progress into a phase where they could start to actualize their future vision of self and moving past kind of dealing with their current health issues, especially for those who are medically releasing. Being able to shift away from the military lifestyle had really complex implications for Canadian Armed Forces members and veterans' sense of identity as people grappled to make sense of the time of wearing a uniform, what it meant to take off a uniform, and where they now fit in the broader civilian community. Bureaucratic aspects really had an impact. So whether or not they felt that their needs had been met, whether or not it had gone smoothly, whether or not there was what was perceived to be like an appropriate level of ceremony upon release that matched people's personal expectations, all of those things seem to accumulate for individuals. Certainly the release from the military opens up opportunities for new time use and activities, but time can be preoccupied with managing the MCT process for many. And then for others, they struggle with this kind of newfound absence of external parameters on how they're to use their time and what their routines are like during the day. Family considerations played a key role in how the MCT unfolded. how families were doing before being able to transition back in, especially for people who'd spent a lot of their career being away from their family for very protracted periods of time during training courses and different forms of deployment or IR situations. And certainly we had a lot of examples where social connections were either maintained through their connection to existing military social networks, or where their people had a kind of a hybrid or a separate civilian social network that they had been building, often intentionally, before release. Objectives 3 and 4 look to identify supports and interventions that were used and try to identify, what was helpful and what was helpful. And what we found was that there was a lot of difference between culture and civilian culture. So how people and when people would access the supports and whether or not they found them helpful, there was definitely a sense of how things were in the CAF and how it was easier to access certain things. And working with Veteran Affairs, it could be difficult to maintain, develop, and persist at certain kinds of service access and supports. We certainly saw a lot of expression for a need for smoother transitions between phases of MCT. So as people prepare for release, are at the point of release, and then are working through the bureaucratic issues, and depending upon your type of release, you may have more administrative responsibilities and how to actually manage those. There was a strong expression as well as a need for personalized support and how people need different things at different points and that they're ready for different things at different points in the CT process. And really, there was a lot of benefit expressed for expanding what is currently considered the kind of time frame of release. For people who spent a lot of time bogged down in the administrative requirements of MCT, as they work through getting their eligibility sorted, getting their benefits established, connecting to new healthcare providers, that time frame disappeared. For others, it was very much in relation to vocational retraining, vocational opportunities, and when and how they had to make choices about, what kinds of vocational trajectories they would place themselves on, and whether or not they were ready to make those decisions at that point in their release process, or whether or not those decisions might better serve them if they could make them a little bit later. In Objective 5, we were asked to look for different types of pathways through this. And one of the things that really became clear as we moved through this is that there were no clear or discrete pathways. So the majority endorsed at least some elements of difficulty or challenge, with the cluster continuing to experience really significant difficulties in establishing in life after military service. So really what we saw was people kind of enacting a trajectory that looked a lot more like choose your own adventure. And there were two kinds of dimensions that shaped that up front. And one was whether or not the transition was planned for, whether or not at this point it was perceived to be a positive occurrence, whether it was unwanted or unexpected. So all of those things kind of converged to see where people kind of start in the MCT process. And then what they need is not linear and is not kind of sequential, depending upon where they enter into the process. Age and connection to workforce and workforce options post-release definitely played into how things unfolded. Health and service related limitations also had an impact. How they saw themselves and whether or not they felt that they could connect to other workforces, other kind of community networks, where they felt that they could experience meaning and purpose, that those elements were very important to their sense of identity. When we saw people experience or languish in a gap between what they had hoped for, what they expected, and where they currently were, that's where we definitely saw some people needing a slower path forward. And that the pathway isn't progressing to, okay, everything's going to be resolved and I'm now on the other side of transition. We did have the opportunity to do some sex and gender-based analysis. And what we found here was that women with or without a medical release, whether it was for physical or mental issues, health really was a priority during the transition. And this finding is consistent with existing research based on the life after service study data. Now, our data also reinforce existing research based on last data showing that Canadian women veterans have lower labor force participation rates upon release from the military. So there are some different things that we're seeing going through. So what this means is that, consistent with the last data, what we found was that there was no single factor affecting participants' mental health and well-being during transition. So what we saw instead was a very intersectional kind of approach where multiple factors, so financial well-being, health, family, social connection, a sense of identity and engagement and purposeful patterns of activity were highly interdependent and ranged around a broad spectrum of possibilities. And so those variability and in different combinations really played out so that it was difficult to see very clear pathways for people. So what we saw, though, was that current theories of transition do not sufficiently capture the complexity of factors that converge. So we don't see a linear, phased, sequential manager that is consistent with most theories. So we're doing ongoing T3 analysis, and so that's going to be exciting as we produce more understanding about what this means for people over the longer term. Should you have any questions, feel free to contact me at heidi.cram@queensu.ca. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cram. Very interesting. And I do have a question from the group. And the question is, I am wondering if you consulted with Canadian Forces Health Services regarding your research. There's an established case management program that is for the ill and injured who are medically released. CAF members are assigned to a nurse case manager.
Well, certainly as part of the perspectives looking at people's experiences of accessing those services. So we did hear quite a lot about how people were perceiving those supports and services to be helpful or not helpful, whether or not they met a need, whether they not met a need, and certainly we did hear about case management services. One of the complexities when you do longitudinal data is that as you're collecting the data, some of the policies and programmings are also changing as we're going through it. So, their perceptions of their experiences from 3 years ago might be different if the same person accesses the same services today. And so we have to take all of that, on whole. So to look at it as an integrated body to help inform policy and program development. We did not, as part of the purpose of this grant, was not to seek input or derive data from Canadian Forces Health Services directly, but to understand the user experiences of moving through the transition process.
Great, thank you. And one more, but this is more of a comment. Thank you, Dr. Cram, for your continued dedication to improving the status quo for our population. As I listened to your presentation, Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory resonated in my thoughts on journeys to achieving our ability to achieve acceptance. So I think just kudos to you, so thank you.
Thanks, and I think as an occupational therapist, some of these core ideas around belonging, meaning, identity, this is where we see what matters to people in their connection to their community and connection to their worlds and their families. This is what can make, a life worth living, whether you're in the military or you're in life after service. How do we actually create life with purpose and meaning for individuals and occupational therapists? I think we have a lot of them on the team, so it's really been interesting to see how that's played out in the analysis as well. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Our next presenter is Timothy Lamb from Defense Research and Development Canada. The title of his presentation is Help Wanted, Examining Brain Activity Underlying Cognitive Performance in Special Forces Operators Exposed to Repeated Low-Level Occupational Blast. Not sure if he's looking for help for research or people willing to expose themselves to low-level occupational blast, but looking forward to hearing the answer to that. Timothy?
Hi, everyone. My name is Timothy Lamb, and the presentation I'm going to talk about today is called Help Wanted, Examining Brain Activity Underlying Cognitive Performance in Special Forces Operators Exposed to Repeated Low-Level Occupational Blast. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, I have no commercial interests to disclose. There are no conflicts of interest, and there has been no influence from any sponsors on the content in this presentation. At the conclusion of this activity, participants will be able to describe differences in brain activity patterns on cognitive tasks between military members with and without low-level blast exposure. So military and law enforcement personnel are often exposed to low-level blasts as part of training for the occupation. And low-level blasts would include breaching, as an example, where people would be using explosives to gain entry into barricaded locations. Breaching is just one example of low-level blasts, or LLB, and other examples would include mortars, rifles, and also hand grenades. And so, importantly, special forces operators such as breachers and snipers are regularly exposed to low-level blasts as part of training for the occupation. A 2016 study led by Ocean Vartanian and Nakashima, Sean Rind, and Catherine Ten at Defense Research and Development Canada found that the accumulation of repetitive low-level blasts has been associated with increased prevalence of reported tinnitus in breacher, staff, and course instructors at the Canadian Forces School of Military Engineering relative to non-breacher CAF controls. In the United States, there were also groups that have looked at breachers and found that there are memory deficits and changes in brain structure and function relative to non-breacher controls. While there's a handful of studies that looked at the effects of repetitive low-level blasts on long-term health, much remains to be studied. And this is because oftentimes studies are looking just at the behavioral or cognitive performance, or just at the brain activity or brain function with respect to low-level blasts. But there's not many studies that really look at the connection between the two or the relationship. And so this is something that we are interested in examining. So to address this gap, we've set out two study objectives. The first is to determine whether there are any differences in cognitive performance between military members with and without low-level blast exposure. And the second objective is to determine the relationship between cognitive performance and brain function in military members with and without low-level blast exposure. And we hypothesized that members with LLB exposure would exhibit lower cognitive performance and distinct brain patterns compared to those without low-level blast exposure. So to test these objectives, we recruited participants from the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, or CANSOFCOM, and there are we have 31 experienced operators prior to beginning a course. We also collected data from 33 CANSOFCOM candidates prior to undergoing selection. And it's important to note that this is a longitudinal study, but the data I'm presenting here is cross-sectional. And secondly, the study is still ongoing, so the findings that I'm showing here today are preliminary in nature. So as part of the study, participants completed a neurocognitive assessment, battery for working memory and executive function. And then participants also underwent a functional MRI brain scan. And there are two scans of interest for us. The first is a resting state fMRI scan, where we're looking at the brain regions and brain networks that are talking with each other while someone is resting, along with a second scan, which is a task fMRI scan, where we're recording the brain activity as someone is completing a working memory test called the Nvac. So there are two neurocognitive assessments of interest within this presentation. And this is a busy slide here. So I want you to first focus on the left side of the screen. Here is the delayed match to sample. And in this case, for the delayed match to sample, or MTS, participants are first presented a 8x8 matrix of red and green squares, and they're asked to study that matrix as best as possible for a few seconds. Afterwards, the matrix will disappear for a brief period, and then they're given two matrices to decide upon. The first matrix, or one of the matrices, is going to be the one that they just saw previously, and the second matrix is one that it looks very similar to the one that they just saw before, except that the placement of one red and one green square has been swapped. And so the participant is supposed to decide upon which matrix is the one that they just previously saw. And in order to test or to score this assessment, we're mainly looking at their accuracy rate at detecting the one that they should have reported seeing before. Now I want you to shift to the right side of the screen, and this is called the Nvac test, and this is a test of working memory. And so here, letters are flashing on the screen every 3 seconds, and there's different conditions. For the one back, we want people to identify when they've seen the same letter right before. With the two back, we want people to identify whether the letter that they're looking at now was seen 2 positions ago. And finally, with the free back, we want to determine if we want people to identify if they've seen the letter that they're looking at right now 3 positions ago. So as the letters are flashing on the screen, participants are asked to think whether they've seen that letter 3 positions ago for the free back, 2 positions ago for the two back, or one position ago for the one back. And what we're scoring for here is called a D prime, which is a measure of sensitivity for how well they can detect that signal, and that signal being the letter that they're looking at right now, and whether they've seen that letter n positions ago. With the so before we get into the findings that I wanted to share with you, first thing we want to look at is, are there any demographic differences between the operators and the candidates? And so there are a lot of expected differences, for example, between the two groups, and that is, for example, the operators are on average older and they have more years of military service in the CAF, and that's expected, and these are things that we can control. We controlled for in the analyses. In addition, the operators also have more years of exposure to explosives, more breaching experience, more sniper experience, and as well more blast exposure. Importantly, however, there are no differences between the two groups with respect to education. The sustained concussion or head injury before are generally equal proportions between the two groups, and also the reported self-measure for general health is on average similar between the two groups as well. So for the match to sample or MTS accuracy, the two groups scored nearly identical, which is around 70% accuracy, and this is definitely a respectable score on the match to sample test. So even though both groups performed relatively similar on the match to sample, we're then interested in whether to look at whether there are any differences in the brain activity patterns. And so 2 networks of interest to us were the executive control network, which is involved in working memory, along with the salience network, which is involved in attention and the combination or combining of the sensory and cognitive information together. So this is a really busy slide, and I guess I first want you to look at the top portion of the screen. So with the top portion of the screen, we're first interested in looking at the connectivity strength of the executive control network. And we wanted to see, with this control network, is it related to match to sample accuracy? And so what we find here is that people who have a stronger executive control network would end up performing better on the match to sample. And this is seen for both the operators and the candidates. And this makes a lot of sense because people who have a stronger executive control network are likely to have a more efficient network and a more robust network, and then have more working memory resources at their disposal to complete the match to sample test. Now I want you to direct your attention to the bottom portion of the screen. So as we've seen it from the top, there's a relationship between the executive control network and the match to sample accuracy score. However, we're also interested in whether there is any relationship between the executive control network and the salience network. And looking at the connectivity between these two networks could be a proxy for whether a person will require using two networks to complete the task as opposed to just one network. And so with the experienced operators, we find here that people who have stronger connections between the executive control and salience network would end up performing better on the master sample. However, that's not the case for the candidates. And this would indicate that the operators would potentially require two networks in sync in order to complete the task, whereas the CAN-SOF-COMP candidates will only require the executive control network to complete the task. Now, switching to the Nvac working memory test, on average, behaviorally, we find that the operators are performing not as well on the master sample, or on the Nvac test relative to the CAN-SOF-COMP candidates. And this is seen by the lower D prime values for the operators relative to the candidates themselves. And this would indicate that the operators do not have as much working memory resources to complete the task relative to the candidates. But how does this map on from a brain imaging perspective? And so this is what we then looked at. And in this case here, with the 1-back and the 2-back conditions, both the experienced operators and the CAN-SOF-COMP candidates showed very similar brain activation patterns. And this is called the frontal parietal activation. And so here at the top portion of the brain are the frontal areas that are lighting up. And these are thought to be involved in developing a strategy or strategies in order to complete the 1-back and the 2-back conditions. Whereas the parietal areas are thought to be involved in trying to execute that plan or that strategy, along with keeping those letters in the person's working memory. And so these areas of activation for both the operators and candidates are often seen in past literature when people are completing this Nvac test. However, I want to bring your attention to the rightmost portion of the screen, and that's the 3-back condition. And here we find that the operators are still showing the frontal parietal areas, whereas the CAN-SOF-COMP candidates are just activating the parietal areas. And this may seem a bit counterintuitive, but the CAN-SOF-COMP candidates appear to only require the parietal areas, perhaps because by the time they hit the 3-back, they're already developed a strategy that they feel is efficient and it works well. And so they're easily just using the same strategy as what they used before, and so they don't require the frontal areas as much to complete the task. In contrast, with the operators, it appears that they're still searching for an optimal strategy, and as they complete the 3-back, and this can perhaps hinder their performance because the 3-back, of course, is the most challenging of the 3 conditions that they're being exposed to during the test. So to conclude, we find that from the results that are shown today, that there are neurological differences that can be observed between members with and without low-level blast exposure, even when cognitive performance is similar. And so, as seen in the match to sample, even though performance-wise they look identical or very similar, from the brain imaging perspective, it appears that there could be other networks that are required to complete the task. And so that's why it's important to really look at the behavior, the brain imaging, and also the combination between the two in order to get a comprehensive picture of the impact of low-level blast exposure. The experienced operators also appear to be recruiting additional brain regions while performing working memory tasks. And this, whether it's the salience network in the matched sample or the frontal areas in the Nvac test, it appears that experienced operators are compensating in order to still perform at an optimal level for these challenging tasks. And finally, the different patterns in brain activity observed in experienced operators may help in achieving adequate or similar task performance as controls. And so in this case, the operators, of course, are still highly functional in their occupation and their everyday lives. And so it's important that we look at this, and this could be potentially a way for the operators to adapt to challenging and difficult situations. So this is something that we have to look at. It's not necessarily a negative thing of what we're showing here, but this could be just a different way to adapt to the same situation as what other people are being exposed to. And so with that, I would like to acknowledge various people I've seen on this slide to make this study possible. And finally, these are the references that I referred to in the presentation here today. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Timothy. So perhaps I'll just start. Very interesting. You said it at the beginning about the differences in a few of the baseline characteristics of the two groups. But I'm just wondering, how do we know that the differences in performance aren't attributable to age? I know that when I was trying to do your tests, I was taking an awfully long time. So is this an age-related difference, or how can we know that it's from the exposure to BLAST or just the operator's course?
A great question. So with this, this is data I haven't necessarily shown in this presentation here, but we're also collecting data from age and sex matched CAF controls who complete the test. And so we also see that these age and sex matched CAF controls perform similar to the candidates. And so this can provide additional support that it's not necessarily the age perspective, but also something with their occupation or their lifestyle that's going on.
Great, thank you. And okay, and maybe I'll just ask one more question then. Here's a question. How do you separate experience from BLAST exposure in explaining the findings? Maybe their brains adapt with experience alone.
Right. So for sure, another great question. And with that, it's, I think as I kind of alluded to near the end of the presentation, it's because it's, when we're looking at the brain activity, we're trying to figure out, is this something that is, I guess, maladaptive, or is this something that's beneficial to them? And I think it's still open to interpretation, really. And I think given that these people are still performing really well in their everyday lives, of course, as they're holding down their difficult occupations, it's something that, you know, could be equally with regards to just adapting. What's important though is that because we do see deficits in their working memory performance, we're thinking along the lines that it could be related to the occupation as opposed to other issues or other things in terms of adapting. But I think this is something that if we were to say track them down the line of, and this is something that is another arm of the study, if we were to track people right from the beginning, from selection and onwards, do we see these changes over time as they are exposed to BLAST?
Great. And one last question from the group here, and then we'll move on. Were other comorbidities that adversely affect executive functioning, such as mental health conditions, controlled for? Right.
So so we've also collected this data, and this is something that we're going to be looking at down the line. This is not something that I personally looked at right now, but we have this data, and this is something that we're definitely interested in controlling for at that.
Great. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Our next presentation is from Major Pauline Godsell. She's going to be talking about current chronic primary pain management collaborative practices within the Canadian Armed Forces physiotherapists and occupational therapists. Major Godsell.
So I'd like to thank CIMVHR for the opportunity to present my work completed at the University of British Columbia on current chronic primary pain management collaborative practices within Canadian Armed Forces physiotherapists and occupational therapists. I have no relationships with commercial interests, no potential conflicts of interest, and therefore no mitigating potential biases. By the end of this presentation, participants should be able to demonstrate improved awareness of the collaborative practices of Canadian Armed Forces physiotherapists and occupational therapists, identify personal and environmental variables associated with the frequency of their evidence-based practices in order to disseminate the descriptive findings and to inform improved evidence-based decision-making, policy, and clinical practices. Before going any further, I'd like to acknowledge that my three co-authors, as well as Major Vincent Bouchard, Captain Kelly DeBouter, and Ms. Louise McCoy for their assistance in recruiting, as well as our pilot test participants. So worldwide, chronic pain impacts individuals, families, activities, relationships, productivity, and healthcare utilization. Canadian Armed Forces personnel are a reflection of Canadian society. However, they experience a higher risk of illness or injury occurrence due to the unique factors of military life. A great deal of evidence on chronic pain and often associated mental health conditions have been amassed in Canadian military and veteran populations. However, patient-centered, collaborative teams, chronic pain management practices within Canadian Force Health Services present a knowledge gap in peer-reviewed literature. Facilitating a safe and rapid return to operational readiness has always been the focus in maintaining a combat-ready force able to deliver on commitments at home and around the world. Para 4.42 of the Auditor's General Report identified the need for best practice multidisciplinary care reviews. The Surgeon General Integrated Health Strategy called for a more integrated approach to care delivery. Canada's defense policy demands adaptability and expansion beyond today's healthcare model, and Minister of National Defense mandate letter in 2009 requested an overall service delivery and reduction in its complexity. The Chronic Pain Center of Excellence Canadian Veteran Network, as well as the Pain Management Best Practice Interagency Task Force Report, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence Chronic Pain Guidance, and it would be remiss not to also include the Canadian Pain Task Force Action Plan, all speak to a global priority to mobilize best practices. The 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11 coding, comes into effect on the 1st of January, which really exemplifies the WHO, World Health Organization, ICF model in improving holistic practices. As such, the ICD-11 chronic primary pain definition was used in this study, and as we are aware, chronic pain is prevalent in military populations. So our research questions were to identify the collaborative practices of Canadian Armed Forces physiotherapists and occupational therapists managing chronic primary pain across Canadian Forces Health Services. The secondary question was to identify personal and environmental variables associated with the frequency of evidence-based chronic primary pain practices. To do so, we adopted the knowledge to action framework in identifying know and do gaps. And as we're all aware, self-efficacy is a precursor to behavior and performance, and is what we were looking at in our participants. A 32-question bilingual online survey was developed using the tailored design method. All Canadian Armed Forces physiotherapists and occupational therapists were invited to participate in January, February 2021. We had a potential sample size of 116 physiotherapists and 10 occupational therapists. 123 responded to the survey. However, only 77 fully completed the survey, representing a 61% response rate. The sample was predominantly white female English physiotherapists under the age of 45, working in Ontario in various opportunities with greater than 10 years military experience. They reported chronic primary pain caseloads of 26 to 50% of their caseloads, and they also identified as being somewhat confident in managing this population and somewhat satisfied in their current jobs. We're going to start with the no gaps. So what we found, 70.7 reported adopting a biopsychosocial model, and the top two reasons for outsourcing this population were skill and the amount of staff to meet the imposed demand. So the ability to practice in an evidence-based manner was also one of our queries. And it was welcoming to find that the level of support from supervisors being the most facilitating factor. However, again, the staffing levels contributed to the workloads being the limiting factors. So Canadian Forces Health Services have developed an interdisciplinary case conference e-note to help facilitate shared treatment planning, decision-making, and goal achievement. However, 90.9% have never received training on the tool. 58.4% report never attending a coordinated case conference, and no regular collaborative rounds are occurring in 71.4% of respondents' work locations. An open-ended question of what is missing was analyzed through content analysis with 5 themes emerging. First and foremost, in order of prevalence, personal knowledge, local processes, national leadership, materials, and staff were identified as areas to improve upon. Returning soldiers to the uniqueness of soldiering, 84.4% agreed improved access to mental health records by circle of care physical rehabilitation clinician would foster improved holistic practices. When we looked at unit collaborations, we really identified a multidisciplinary consultative approach where primary care is referring to mental health and diagnostic and therapeutic clinicians. We also looked at meeting unit, community, and organizational collaborations. And within the unit collaborations, pairwise comparison did reveal a significant difference in unit collaboration frequencies between Ontario and Quebec through the Benjamini-Hochberg corrected p-value of 0.008. And as you can see, there is a lack in collaborations with our mental health clinicians. So Canadian Armed Forces physiotherapists and occupational therapists are abiding by best practices. They are using education and exercise as their primary tools with this population. An area to improve upon is behavior-based therapies. And it was very interesting with 18.2% of physiotherapists expressing that behavior-based therapies would actually fall outside of their scope of practice, which we know is not true. The top 5 groups programs to further develop and promulgate exemplify the need for education and providing members with early self-management skills. So our online survey facilitated a rapid distribution and return across a vast territory during an unprecedented pandemic with minimal financial expenditures. A recurring limiting factor theme featured throughout the study was staffing levels. As reported by Lida et al. In 2019, in complex environments such as Canadian Forces Health Services, continuously working in silos acts as a restraining force, perpetuating poor and fragmented processes, communications, and interactions, as well as protectionism that impacts teamwork and decentralization of power. With a mandated governmental priority overhaul service delivery and reduce complexity, shared biopsychosocial management practices are tangible goals to attain. Chronic pain management topics should be prioritized in reviews, given their prevalence in military populations. And we should collaborate with our PSP fitness and health promotion teams in managing these populations. Additionally, having patients engage their chains of command also facilitates a triad of responsibility and will promote improved narratives in goal achievement and reintegrations. Finally, spiritual health expands past faith to include relationships to culture, identity, and ways of life, providing a sense of purpose, meaning, beliefs, and values. And as such, chaplains should be considered in managing this population. In 2015, Cato et al. Proposed a continuum for interprofessional collaborative practices. And this is a model that Canadian Forces Health Services should consider, as it is a continuum and it does speak to really addressing patient needs. Limitations. This is it does represent cross-sectional data. Social desirability bias may have occurred. It was a study that occurred during the coronavirus pandemic, so some answers may be skewed. And convenience, it was a convenient sample, therefore we have differing sample sizes, and a few did not respond to the survey. So recommendations in future study: continuing quality improvement and innovation to messaging, education, and programming offered to Canadian Armed Forces in meeting their chronic primary pain needs in a consistent and supportive manner is required. Examining discrepancies in physical rehabilitation, human resource allocations, and clinician roles or interactions across the country are required. Within a military context, reconnaissance is vital to continuously contributing to mission success. Chronic pain impacts individuals, families, activities, relationships, productivity, and healthcare utilization. Based on this study's findings, practice change that move Canadian Forces away from silos to improve biopsychosocial collaborations will achieve patient-centered, multimodal, multidisciplinary chronic pain program delivery. So I'd like to thank you for your time today. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them. If you're curious about any of the references used in preparing this presentation. And again, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Major. Perhaps I'll kick us off. And so I think you've identified that there's great variation in some of the factors that might contribute to more uniformity in physiotherapist practice across Canada. So like supervisor support and various other things. So if you had to pick, you know, because of limited funding, if you had to pick one or two things for the forces to invest in for physiotherapy and occupational therapy across Canada, what would they be to improve the situation?
Thank you so much for the question, sir. I think I'd definitely be focusing on education and exercise to ensure that we have the programming available for our members. A chronic pain program would be amazing, and if it would standardize across the CAF, it would be a great opportunity for members to have equal opportunity.
And just for the audience, what's the magnitude of the chronic pain problem that we see in the forces? So
within the Canadian Forces, I'm really interested in looking at that number. I think the ICD-11 coding will improve that. The stats that I was looking at in terms all came from our Veterans Affairs life after service studies, where it was twofold. So I believe we'll see the same thing within the Canadian Forces, especially post-pandemic.
So the next presentation is from Major Joshua Robbins, and he'll be talking about the vaccination campaign performance management, a CAF COVID-19 response. Major Robbins.
Hello, my name is Major Joshua Robbins. I'm a very lonely person, no relationships with commercial interests, and no commercial support, no financial support, in-kind support of any kind, so no conflicts of interest. As such, nothing's been done to try to mitigate any of those non-existing things. And let's start off with some learning objectives as per submitted in my abstract. The goal of this presentation is to help the listeners understand the importance of common evidence-based decision-making tools between leadership and health service professionals, in hopes that it will improve the results of health programs through closer collaboration. A couple of references from the products that you'll see within the presentation. And I'll just start off by reintroducing myself. Major Joshua Robbins. Why are we looking at an Army slide here? Well, I work at the Canadian Army headquarters in the Directorate of Army Staff, within a section that's responsible for the governance and the management of governance within the Army. Specifically, I tend to work in the realm of data and data policy, trying to evaluate the Canadian Army's outputs and adapt them to re-inform the governance in the next cycle to ensure that we have better outcomes in the future. I've been very intrigued by COVID-19 since very early in the outbreak. And, it was late 2021 that I all of a sudden got called by my director and to ask me about a task with health services. He wanted to know who would be the best person to help health services plan the internal vaccination campaign for the Canadian Armed Forces. Being that I was already intrigued by COVID-19 and open data by the governments, provincial and federal, I jumped all over the opportunity. I assessed this as being probably the turning point in the most pivotal time of my life and wanted to be a part of that cause. So with that, he gave me 36 hours to report to Lieutenant Colonel Chris Snyder, the senior staff officer, and his director, the director of health service operations, Colonel Colleen Forestier, at the Directorate of Health Services, to help them assist the planning of the Operation Vector Internum, the internal Canadian Armed Forces vaccination campaign. And just to reiterate, to be sure, this does not have anything to do with PHAC and how the Canadian Armed Forces was assisting the Government of Canada externally. So, problem statement. This is what I'm going to cover in the presentations. Problem statement, I'm going to go through some of the performance management framework that we set up, a little bit of the discussion about the solution space and how we got there, the reports that we produced, and then recommend maybe some further research before my conclusion. So before going to health services, I knew very little about strategic health services. I knew what a Stratovac medical plan was, but beyond that, I didn't know much. And the health services team had been after COVID-19 for over a year, and they were firing on all cylinders. It took a little while for me to learn the ropes, but then I heard my opportunity. We needed a common operating picture that would promote cooperation between health services and the chain of command in optimizing the Canadian Armed Forces vaccination campaign. I quickly volunteered for this task. Given my previous experience, I know I was well suited for it. I was given something, what we see at the bottom of the screen there, from the health services team. This is a product that they saw from Indigenous Services Canada on how they were doing some reporting. An example of some of the metrics on the left side there, how we might illustrate a base. And this was kind of my starting point, where I started my research on how to create this common operating picture. One of the first things I noted in my research for this performance management system was Dr. Teresa Tam described the indicators, the measures of effectiveness in that red box, as lagging indicators for a vaccination campaign. They will tell us how the vaccination campaign went, but they wouldn't be particularly helpful in the conduct of the campaign. I started dividing up and organizing all the measures of performance, and I came up with two groups. The green line and the green box were the measures of performance that had to do with the administration of the campaign, mostly based off the G4 data. This was kind of like the supply side of the equation that we were dealing with. On the other hand, another group of measures of performance was the demand side. This had to do with the uptake, how well the chain of command was enabling their people and how well our people were at getting their vaccination. This was mostly based off the CFHIS data. And lastly, the last set, which became our internal measures of effectiveness, was a group of metrics around capacity utilization, the attendance over the capacity provided by health services. If we could optimize what health services were putting up on the green line and match it with what was being provided by the chain of command for patients who were willing to be vaccinated or at least attend a vaccination parade to be informed, we were going to make the best use of our resources in what was already a resource-constrained environment. So this slide is looking at data model accessibility and privacy. This was one of the bones of contention in creating this model that created a lot of discussion between ourselves in the operations, with the ethics and the privacy officers and the CFHIS team. And what we need to do was create that model that would allow both the chain of command and the health services team to look at the data together and determine how well they're doing and how they could do better. So along the x-axis, we have the amount of data that's in the data model. On the far left, we have less and less sensitive data. And as we move right, we would have a model that has more and more sensitive data. On the left, on the y-axis, we simply have just a high to low scale that's related to each of the lines. The black line has to do with accessibility. The less data we have, the more accessible it can be on the protected A side of the dotted line. But as we meet that protected B threshold at that dotted line, the accessibility significantly decreases because of the inverse relationship with the privacy risk associated with that data. So not only can people not actually access the data, or it is more complicated to access the data, the risk of some people getting that data is that they misuse it, and it can actually be a danger because they don't necessarily have the correct education to use that data. So this was kind of like the pivoting point, and what we needed was something just on the protected A side that the chain of command could use, but close enough to the dotted line that the health services team thought that there was still some value. So let's build on this model now. So this is about data model utility for this tool. And along the x-axis, no change. Less and less sensitive data to the left to more and more sensitive data on the far right. On the left, however, now we're going from high to low, talking about the utility of a particular data model for a particular group. And those lines are the groups. These are not based off data. These are conceptual, just an estimate of where they might be. But for the chain of command, a peak value from a data model would probably occur somewhere on the protected A side, close to the dotted line, as you can see by the peak there. This is because it's accessible, and they also don't even impose any risk to themselves by divulging or misusing privacy data. Now, for a health services professional, I put a conceptual red line there. Now, this could be very different for a technician compared to a clinician or compared to an epidemiologist, but let's just use this one model here so we don't have too many lines on the graph. As we can see, the real value in a data model for the health services professional is more likely to be on the protected B side, because that is where care is happening. That is where we're able to make and draw better deductions about what is happening to total force health. But however, you are not going to get the chain of command to work in that environment because A, they will not likely go and get access to DRIMIS or CFHIS, and B, they actually may pose a risk to themselves by having such information. So there is still some value on the left side for the health services professional. And this is not to say they do not need the other systems in the protected B environment, but in the protected A environment, there is value to be had with health services professionals and the chain of command working together to enable their members to make better health decisions by reducing socioeconomic barriers and getting them to a vaccination point so that they can make a decision based solely on the health factors and not numerous other things in their life that may be impeding their attendance at that vaccination parade. So let's have a look at the model. Now, this is just the dashboard of the common operating picture. I hope you can appreciate the sensitivity if I were to show everything in this environment. So I'll just stick here to the landing page. And as you can see, this is very early in the vaccination campaign. We are just in the throes of like putting up the first vaccinations, and we are surging. The first week wave there of vaccinations is done, and we're moving into the second week. This landing page kind of gives a little bit of everything. You've got the solicitation rate up at the top right. You've got the doses down in the line and bar graph. But there was also other slides that showed specifically the supply side, the demand side, and also the equilibrium point. The equilibrium got some use. The demand side got quite a bit of use. And there was a little bit of use on the supply side, but the health service team was very checked out, and there was very few concerns or need to look at it. All in all, the campaign went really well. And spoiler alert, the Canadian Forces got very vaccinated and very quickly. So the health services team should be very proud of all that work that they did along with their chain of commands. in supporting their soldiers in making good health decisions. Recommended research from here building on this. Influenza vaccination. Is it a given that we have to have low influenza vaccination rates? Or could we use such a model to promote chains of command and enabling their soldiers to get to a vaccination line? Left out of battle rates is an area of great interest. If we had something that would allow us to really look at left out of battle rates across our force, it'd be very interesting to see if we could optimize and enable corporate learning across the organization to improve the left out of battle rate. Lastly, data and analytics is an arduous process. It is not necessarily always more efficient, but if it results in more effectiveness, it may be worth doing it. Therefore, we need to look at what is the extra cost, and does that extra cost of 1 day more data and analytics result in 100 days more readiness in the force? If so, we have a better case for making further investments in data and analytics to inform the chain of command, health services, and ultimately our readiness. So in conclusion, employing data and analytics requires effort. A common operating picture can be used to motivate leadership and synchronize with health services. Reducing socioeconomic barriers for the soldiers promotes better health decisions, and better total force health increases readiness. So I hope at this point I've been able to communicate that better cooperation between health services and leadership in the chain of command using data models that they can both look at together would be of a benefit to the Canadian Armed Forces, improving total force health and our readiness to continue the fight. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Major Robinson. A very topical conversation across Canada as we strive to increase vaccination rates. Just a clarifying question for me as we wait for questions to come in is your graph on utility of data versus the security on it, so protected A and protected B. So they were sort of bell-shaped graphs. Are you saying that as the security increases more and more, there's no utility of the data, or should it have been more of a plateau of the utility?
Yeah, there certainly is still utility, but I would say that it depends on who's using it. But yeah, I think at a certain point you can have too much data. In some realms, big data is very useful, but then sometimes just using small data can get you a lot of answers. So I think maybe if we focus in on a specific thing like vaccinations, you can get to a point where you do have too much data and it becomes kind of useless to add more, and it just makes the process more complicated. And then it makes the data less accessible because you have to be concerned that if somebody's looking at this data, they're also going to find out about somebody's mental health when they're really just trying to figure out about their vaccination state.
Right. Okay, and I don't see any other questions. I have one other question then, I guess, is do you have a sense then of, and this is a little less to do with the specifics of your presentation, but of the people, and I think I've heard that CAF has been very successful with its vaccination program, but what were some of the themes for people who were hesitant? Did that ever come out, or do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so yeah, anecdotally, what does Major Josh Robbins think, who's not an epidemiologist? Okay, I think trust in government, we're seeing that in society, is a major factor, and I think the military kind of norms towards the center and having quite high trust in government, I think that played a significant role. And when we're talking about in there the chain of command having the data to know what their vaccination rates were on different bases, it motivated them to reduce socioeconomic barriers to getting vaccinated. So active refusal on some bases may have been, hey, answer this email, select yes or no, I don't want my vaccination. On other bases, it looked like, attention, left turn, quick march, sit down beside the needle. Do you want to have a needle or no? There's no other excuse. It's long drive, no childcare, too busy, too important. So I think reducing those barriers and then having people who trusted their leadership and their government all played together.
Makes sense. And a question, I guess, related, but a little more broadly, what is known about the reasons for vaccine hesitancy more broadly in the military?
I I didn't spend too much time looking at it. My hunch would be that it's the immediate leadership, not senior leadership. If the corporal's looking at their sergeant and their sergeant is actively speaking positively about vaccination, I think that is going to lend itself to a better result than if there's misinformation at the junior leadership level. So, and getting that information down and having people informed. And that's where having people sit in a room, receive a brief about the vaccination, and then sit beside the needle and make a choice in privacy lended itself to people making more informed choices as opposed to choices based off what's happening on the shop floor or in Facebook.
Great. And maybe I'll just ask one more question then. Do you think there was a difference, like the approach of sort of quick march to sit beside the needle, and then do you have any questions? Was there a difference in types of unit or elements? So like infantry versus Army versus Navy versus Air Force, were there any differences in vaccination rates? I don't know if you have that answer.
So yeah, like early on, we did see maybe, let's not call it hesitancy, a slower uptake early on bases that used electronic tools, like go to a website to sign up for your vaccination time, which is a good thing. People should be using electronic tools compared to bases where people were paraded through. Whether that's resolved itself since I left the program, I don't know. But yeah, I think that's not that the people did not want to get vaccinated. It had more to do with, it was easy to just not open up the email or just respond, too busy right now, I'll get to it later, and less to do with the actual choice of the individual. So, and I think like the electronic tools were a very good idea, but they created kind of a double standard in what was active refusal.
Okay, I think that's it for the session. So thank you very much, very interesting, and thanks for really getting the vaccination rates high in the CAF. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that concludes this session, and I just, I wanted to thank all the presenters. It really, I think CAF operations and CFHS operations are becoming more diverse. There's all these different reasons that are new that come up for reasons for why we need to deploy both internationally and domestically. And I think the scope of the research that's shown here suggests that we have a very robust program that looks to support our soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women in whatever endeavor they're doing on deployment. So thank you for leading this research and presenting this research. I'd like to now invite Dr. David Pedler to deliver some closing remarks.
Thank you all for joining us on day one of CIMVHR Virtual Forum. I want to extend a special thank you to Colonel Homer Tien and Lieutenant Colonel Andrea Tuca. Your leadership in moderating today's session was exceptional. To the researchers who presented today, thank you for the time and effort you put into educating all of us on your important research findings. We have all learned so much from you today. I would also like to encourage all of you to submit your research to CIMVHR's journal, the Journal of Military, Veteran, and Family Health. Details on how to do this can be found on the CIMVHR website under Publications. I would also like to take a moment to thank two new CIMVHR Forum sponsors. Platinum sponsor, the Canadian Institute for Public Safety, Research and Treatment, also known as CIPCERT, and gold sponsor, Canadian Cannabis Clinics. We are grateful for your support and for your commitment to serving those who serve us. Please take some time to visit all the sponsor booths in the conference platform. I look forward to seeing everyone next Thursday, October 14th, for day 2 of oral presentations that will focus on the veteran population. To all of you and your families, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.